There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They knock on the door dressed in the plain clothes of a Tuesday morning, and you let them in without a second thought, because you have no way of knowing they are carrying the entire weight of your future in their hands. They are the quiet hinges on which the door to the rest of your life swings open. For me, that moment smelled of sandalwood and bergamot. It smelled like my own skin, but on someone else. It smelled like Julian. He was standing in the hallway that connected our two small bedrooms, a space so narrow we'd long ago perfected a kind of dance to pass each other without touching, a slight turn of the shoulders, a subtle intake of breath. But on this morning, there was no dance. He was blocking the path, pulling a dark gray sweater over his head, and the motion displaced the air, sending a cloud of a scent I knew better than my own name directly into my path. It was my cologne, the one I'd been wearing for 3 years, the one I saved for days when I needed to feel more like myself. He settled the sweater over his torso, oblivious to the fact that he had just detonated a small, silent bomb in the center of our quiet apartment. My heart, which had learned a dangerous rhythm around him, a frantic, hopeful staccato followed by a long, slow ache of resignation, stumbled in my chest. For 2 years, I had lived in a state of suspended animation, a photographer freezing moments in my mind because I was too afraid to live in them. I had cataloged the precise shade of gold in his hair when the afternoon sun hit it, the exact cadence of his laughter when he was truly amused, the way the muscles in his back shifted when he reached for something on the top shelf. These were my secret treasures, my hoard of unrequited observations. And in all that time, the boundary between us had been maintained by 1,000 unspoken rules. We were best friends. We were roommates. We were an island of two in the chaotic sea of our early 20s. But there were lines. My side of the bathroom counter, his side. My bookshelf, his gaming console. My feelings, his unknowingness. The cologne was mine. It was a part of my carefully constructed armor, a piece of my identity. And he was wearing it. He finally looked up, a small, easy smile on his face, the kind he gave me when he was about to say something that was either deeply profound or utterly ridiculous. His eyes, the color of moss after a rainstorm, met mine, and for a second, I thought he could see the entire frantic symphony of my thoughts. I thought he could see the panic and the hope and the sheer, terrifying wonder of it all. I must have had a question on my face, because his smile widened just a fraction. He gestured vaguely toward his own neck, a self-conscious little motion that was so unlike him. "It was on the counter," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Hope you don't mind." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. What could I possibly say? "I do mind. I mind because it feels like you've reached into my chest and taken out the one thing I thought was mine alone. I mind because smelling it on you makes me want to do things that would destroy the most important friendship I've ever had." Instead, I just shook my head, a tiny, jerky motion. He seemed to take that as acceptance, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his gaze analytical in a way that was new, that was unnerving. The silence stretched, filled only by the scent of sandalwood and the frantic beating of my own heart. He was searching for something in my expression, and the intensity of it made me feel pinned to the wall. Then, he spoke again, and the words were quiet, a confession whispered into the small space between us. "I like smelling like what you love." And the door to the rest of my life, the one I had been guarding so carefully, didn't just swing open. It was blown clean off its hinges. It was a statement so audacious, so impossibly vulnerable, that it left no room for interpretation. It wasn't a question. It was an answer to a question I had never dared to ask, a question I had buried so deep within myself I had almost forgotten it was there. He wasn't just wearing my cologne. He was wearing my heart on his sleeve, and he was telling me he liked the fit. The ordinary Tuesday morning was over. Nothing would ever be ordinary again. Our story didn't begin with a seismic shift, but with the quiet, mundane process of cohabitation. We were assigned as freshman roommates by a housing algorithm that, in a stroke of cosmic genius or sheer dumb luck, had managed to pair the human equivalent of a sunbeam with a shadow. Julian arrived first, his presence exploding into the sterile white box of our dorm room before I'd even found a place to park. His side of the room was already a controlled chaos of swim team duffel bags, engineering textbooks that looked like ancient tomes, and a poster of some obscure indie band that seemed completely at odds with the rest of his persona. He was all kinetic energy, a whirlwind of easy smiles and loud, genuine laughter. He introduced himself with a handshake that was firm and warm and lingered just a second too long, his eyes crinkling at the corners as if he'd already decided we were going to be the best of friends. I, on the other hand, was a study in quietude. I arrived with 2 suitcases and a camera bag, my worldly possessions neatly contained. My name is Leo, and I have always preferred to experience the world through a lens, to frame it, to capture it, to hold it at a safe distance. People, in their beautiful, messy unpredictability, had always been a source of anxiety for me. I'd learned to observe from the periphery, to find my place in the quiet spaces others overlooked. Living with someone like Julian, someone who seemed to take up so much space not just physically but emotionally, felt like a social experiment I was destined to fail. I unpacked my things with a silent, methodical precision, creating a small bastion of order on my side of the room, a visual representation of the walls I kept firmly in place around myself. For the first few weeks, we orbited each other like wary planets, our gravitational fields testing the other's boundaries. He would come crashing into the room after a grueling morning practice, smelling of chlorine and exhaustion, and I would be sitting at my desk, editing photos, lost in a world of light and shadow. He would talk, filling the silence with stories about his teammates, complaints about his thermodynamics professor, plans for the weekend. I would listen, offering non-committal hums and the occasional question, my focus still half-lodged in the digital darkroom on my screen. I was a spectator to his life, and that suited me just fine. Friendship, I assumed, was not in the cards for us. We were too different, our energies too fundamentally opposed. He was a force of nature, I was the landscape it moved through. The change came subtly, not in a single moment, but in a slow erosion of my defenses. It began with coffee. He noticed I couldn't function without a morning cup, and one day, after pulling an all-nighter to finish a project, I stumbled out of bed to find a steaming mug on my desk. He'd woken up for his 5 a.m. practice and made an extra one for me before he left. He didn't mention it. The mug was just there, a silent offering. It was a gesture so simple, so unexpectedly thoughtful, that it breached my walls in a way no conversation ever could. I started leaving a sketchbook open to a new drawing on his desk in return. He started saving me a seat in the dining hall. We began to build a language, not of words, but of small, quiet actions. We were learning to care for each other. I discovered that beneath the bright, extroverted surface, Julian was a creature of intense discipline and profound anxiety. The pressure to perform in the pool, to maintain his scholarship, to live up to the expectations of his family, it all weighed on him. I would watch him sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, staring at a textbook with a tension in his jaw that betrayed the easy confidence he projected to the world. It was in those moments that I started to see the real Julian, not the sunbeam, but the person who was afraid of the dark. And my role began to shift from spectator to something more. I became the person who could sit with him in the silence, who didn't need him to perform. I was the calm harbor to his restless tide. My own feelings, however, were undergoing a more treacherous transformation. I had always found him beautiful, in the objective way one admires a piece of sculpture. He was built for his sport, all long lines and efficient muscle, a study in elegant power. But my appreciation slowly curdled into something deeper, something more personal and far more dangerous. I remember the exact moment the shift occurred. It was late in our sophomore year. He'd caught a nasty flu that had knocked him flat for a week. He was finally on the mend, but still weak, and had fallen asleep on the lumpy dorm room sofa while trying to study. His textbook was open on his chest, rising and falling with his slow, even breaths. The late afternoon light was pouring through the window, catching the gold in his hair, tracing the line of his jaw. I was across the room, working on a photography assignment, but my camera lay forgotten in my lap. I just watched him. There was a vulnerability in his sleeping face, a complete absence of the carefully constructed persona he wore for the world. All the energy, the laughter, the confidence, it was all stripped away, and what was left was just Julian, peaceful, unguarded. And in that moment, a feeling washed over me that was so powerful, so terrifyingly potent, it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't friendship. It was a profound, aching affection that settled deep in my bones. It was the kind of feeling that demanded to be acted upon, and I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach clench, that acting on it would mean the end of us. He was Julian. He was my best friend. He dated women, a string of bright, cheerful girls who seemed like female versions of his public self. Our world, our quiet sanctuary of mutual support and easy companionship, was built on the unshakable foundation of platonic friendship. To confess my feelings would be to take a sledgehammer to that foundation. It would make him uncomfortable. It would make him question every moment of intimacy we'd ever shared. It would taint the purity of our bond. He would pull away, create distance, and the quiet harbor I had become for him would be closed forever. The loss of that, the loss of him, was a prospect I couldn't bear. So I made a choice. I picked up my camera, and I took a picture. I framed him in the golden light, captured the peaceful vulnerability of his sleep, and I locked the image away. It was a perfect metaphor for my love. It was something I could possess, something I could look at, but it was a frozen moment, a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional truth. I would become an archivist of my own heart. I would collect these moments, these feelings, and store them in a gallery inside myself that no one else would ever see. I would love him silently, from a safe distance, through the viewfinder of my own quiet observation. It was a lonely decision, but it felt like the only one I could make. The friendship was too precious to risk. I would rather have him as a friend than not have him at all. And so, for the next 2 years, that is exactly what I did. I built a fortress of unspoken feelings around my heart and learned to live within its walls, content to have him near, even if he could never truly be mine. The architecture of our friendship, so carefully designed and maintained through 4 years of college, was tested when we decided to get an apartment together after graduation. It felt like a natural progression, the only logical next step. Julian had been scouted by a competitive swim club in the city, a stepping stone to national trials, and I had been offered a junior position at a small but respected photography studio. The idea of navigating that new, intimidating world without him as my anchor was unthinkable. Our bond had become the central pillar of my life, a source of stability in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. The apartment we found was small, a second-floor walk-up with creaky floors and mismatched appliances, but it had 2 bedrooms and a living room with a large window that flooded the space with soft, forgiving light. It was our fortress against the world. For the first year, things continued much as they had in college. He trained with a singular, ferocious focus, his life dictated by the unforgiving clock of practice schedules and qualifying times. I worked long hours at the studio, learning the trade, honing my eye, and spending my weekends wandering the city with my camera, still capturing the world from my preferred distance. Our home was the place we returned to, shedding the armor we wore for everyone else. It was where his exhaustion was met with my quiet, where my creative frustrations were met with his unwavering belief in my talent. The unspoken rules were still in effect. The boundary between my feelings and our friendship remained, a line drawn in the sand that I was careful never to cross. I was content in my role as the keeper of our shared peace, the silent partner in his journey. The catalyst for the shift, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a slow, grinding fracture. It started in his shoulder, a dull ache he initially dismissed as overuse, a standard complaint for a swimmer pushing his body to its absolute limit. But the ache didn't fade. It sharpened. It began to catch, a snag in the fluid, powerful motion of his freestyle stroke. I watched the worry etch itself into the lines around his eyes. He became quieter, more withdrawn. The easy, kinetic energy that had always defined him began to dim, like a light bulb slowly burning out. The diagnosis, when it finally came from a specialist, was a torn rotator cuff. The words were clinical, detached, but they landed in our small living room like a death sentence. Surgery was an option, the doctor had said, but the recovery would be long. 6 months, maybe more, of intensive physical therapy. There were no guarantees he would ever get back to his previous form, to the split-second advantages that separated the elite from the merely excellent. His entire identity, everything he had worked for since he was a child, was suddenly precarious. The sunbeam was eclipsed. The whirlwind of energy became a dead calm. He withdrew from his teammates, who didn't know how to talk to him about anything other than swimming. He stopped answering calls from his parents, who he knew would only layer their own anxieties on top of his. The world he had built for himself, a world of clear lanes and finish lines, had dissolved into a murky, uncertain fog. And in that fog, he turned to me. I became his entire world. I drove him to his consultations, sat in sterile waiting rooms while he underwent scans, and listened as he replayed the doctor's words over and over, trying to find a loophole, a different interpretation that offered more hope. When he finally had the surgery, I was the one who picked him up, who helped him navigate the simple, agonizing tasks of dressing himself, of getting a glass of water. His right arm was locked in a bulky sling, a constant, physical reminder of his brokenness. He was suddenly fragile, dependent, and it was a role he wore with a deep, simmering frustration that often boiled over into anger, not at me, but at the world, at his own body for betraying him. It was during this time that the unspoken rules began to fray. The carefully maintained distance between us collapsed out of necessity. I had to help him shower, carefully wrapping his shoulder in plastic, my hands brushing against his skin in a way that was purely functional but sent jolts of electricity through my system. I had to cut his food for him, sitting beside him while he ate awkwardly with his left hand. The physical intimacy was constant, unavoidable, and stripped of all romantic context. And yet, for me, it was anything but. Every touch was a paradox, an act of care that was also a source of secret, agonizing torment. My heart, the one I had so carefully shielded, was now exposed, beating just beneath the surface of my skin. He started needing more than just physical assistance. He needed a tether. The nights were the worst. He couldn't sleep, his mind racing with anxieties about his future, the physical pain in his shoulder a dull, throbbing metronome counting down the seconds of his lost career. He would wander out into the living room, a ghost haunting our small apartment, and just stand by the large window, staring down at the empty street. I would find him there, a silhouette against the city lights, and I would make him tea, and we would sit in the dark, not speaking. The silence was different now. It was heavier, filled with his pain and my desperate, helpless wish that I could take it from him. He was adrift, and I was the only piece of solid ground he could find. The lines of our friendship weren't just blurring. They were being washed away by a tide of shared crisis, and a new, terrifyingly intimate landscape was beginning to emerge in its place. The ritual began on a Tuesday night, about 3 weeks after his surgery. It was born not of intention, but of sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. Julian had endured a particularly brutal physical therapy session that day, one that had left him pale and trembling, the pain in his shoulder radiating through his entire body. He'd barely spoken a word since I'd picked him up, his silence a heavy blanket smothering the air in the apartment. After a dinner he only picked at, we retreated to the living room, our default sanctuary. I put on a movie, some mindless action film I hoped would offer a distraction, a temporary escape from the relentless loop of his own thoughts. He sank into one corner of the couch, and I took the other, the familiar 3 feet of space between us a silent testament to the boundaries that still, technically, existed. About halfway through the film, I noticed his head had started to droop. He was fighting sleep, his body desperate for rest, but his mind too agitated to allow it. His eyelids would flutter closed, then jerk open again. It was painful to watch. Without thinking, without allowing myself to second-guess the impulse, I shifted slightly on the couch. "You can lean on me if you want," I said, my voice quiet, barely a whisper. "It's okay to sleep." He looked at me, his eyes cloudy with pain and fatigue. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, a flicker of the old Julian, the one who was self-reliant and never showed weakness. Then, something inside him seemed to give way. He let out a long, shuddering breath and slowly, tentatively, leaned his head against my shoulder. The contact was electric. I went completely still, my entire body rigid, every nerve ending firing at once. His hair, soft and smelling faintly of the shampoo I'd helped him with earlier, brushed against my cheek. I could feel the warmth of him, the subtle weight of his trust. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly. I could not, would not, spook him. This was not about me. This was about him. He needed an anchor, and I had offered one. He was asleep within minutes, his breathing evening out into a soft, rhythmic whisper. I sat there in the dark, the movie playing on, unnoticed. I was acutely aware of every single point of contact between our bodies, the pressure of his head on my shoulder, the warmth of his arm pressed against mine, the way his leg rested lightly against my own. It was the most exquisite torture I had ever known. To have him this close, to be granted this level of physical intimacy, was everything I had ever secretly wanted. But it was all under a false pretense. This wasn't affection, it was necessity. It wasn't desire, it was desperation. I was a fixture, a piece of furniture, a warm body to lean on in a moment of crisis. I repeated this to myself like a mantra, trying to keep my own treacherous feelings locked away. But it was a losing battle. The archivist had left the gallery. He was now part of the exhibition, and the feeling of Julian's sleeping form against mine was a masterpiece of agonizing beauty. That night set the precedent. It became our new normal. The ritual. Every evening, we would end up on the couch, and at some point, he would gravitate toward me. It started with his head on my shoulder. Then, a week later, he was so drained and emotionally raw that he curled up completely, tucking his knees toward his chest and resting his head in my lap. I remember staring down at him, my hand hovering in the air, wanting so badly to run my fingers through his hair, to offer a comfort that went beyond mere physical support. I eventually rested my hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, and just left it there, a steady, grounding pressure. He sighed in his sleep and seemed to sink deeper into me, as if my touch was the final permission he needed to let go completely. This ritual was a universe of unspoken things. It lived in a gray area of plausible deniability. He was injured. He was in pain. He was emotionally devastated. He just needed comfort. Any friend would do this. That was the official narrative, the one that allowed this to continue without shattering the fragile peace of our cohabitation. But underneath that narrative, a different story was being written, one of touch and scent and proximity. I learned the rhythm of his breathing as he slept, the way he would sometimes murmur things in his dreams, the specific weight and warmth of him that was becoming as familiar to me as my own. The couch became a sacred space, an island where the rules of the outside world, and even the old rules of our own friendship, were suspended. For me, it was a slow descent into a beautiful madness. My life became a study in duality. By day, I was the dutiful friend, the caretaker, my actions all practical and platonic. By night, I was the secret lover, holding the man I adored in my arms, drowning in a proximity that was both a blessing and a curse. I was filled with a constant, low-grade anxiety. I was terrified of him waking up and realizing the implication of our positions. I was terrified of him seeing the look on my face as I watched him sleep. I was terrified of making one wrong move, one sigh that was too contented, one touch that was too tender, and revealing the vast, cavernous depth of my feelings for him. The tension was unbearable, a wire pulled taut inside my chest. But the thought of stopping, of suggesting we go back to our separate corners of the couch, was even more so. This nightly ritual had become as necessary for me as it was for him. It was a dangerous, addictive drug, and I was completely, hopelessly hooked. I was living on a knife's edge, caught between the heaven of his closeness and the hell of knowing it didn't mean what I wanted it to mean. Or, even more terrifyingly, the hell of not knowing if it did. The weeks bled into months, and the ritual on the couch became as ingrained in our lives as making coffee in the morning. Julian's shoulder was healing, the sharp, constant pain dulling to a persistent ache. His physical therapy was slowly rebuilding his strength, but the psychological wounds were far from closed. The future of his swimming career remained a giant, looming question mark, and the anxiety it produced was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of our days. Our nightly arrangement continued, no longer an exception born of extreme pain, but a routine born of a deep, unspoken need. It was the way we ended our days, a silent affirmation that, no matter what happened, we had this. We had each other. The plausible deniability was wearing thin, the excuse of his injury becoming less and less relevant, yet neither of us acknowledged it. We existed in a bubble of willful ignorance, two people pretending they didn't notice the world they had built was changing shape around them. The crossing happened on a Sunday. It had been a quiet day, one of those rare, unstructured afternoons that felt like a deep breath. It was raining outside, a steady, gentle drumming against the window pane that insulated us from the rest of the world. We hadn't done much of anything. We'd made pancakes, read on opposite ends of the couch, and talked about nothing important. Julian had even laughed, a real, genuine laugh, for the first time in what felt like weeks. The tension that usually radiated from him had eased, replaced by a soft, weary peace. As evening fell, the rain continued, and the room grew dark around us. I didn't turn on the lights. The glow from the streetlights outside cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of profound intimacy. We had migrated into our usual positions on the couch. He was curled against my side, his head resting on my chest, my arm draped loosely around his shoulders. The television was off. The only sounds were the rain and the soft whisper of our breathing. For a long time, we just sat in the comfortable silence. I was in my usual state of hyper-awareness, cataloging the feeling of his weight against me, the warmth seeping through my shirt, the faint, clean scent of his hair. But tonight, something felt different. The air was charged, heavy with unspoken words. The usual anxiety that hummed within me was still there, but it was accompanied by a new feeling, a sense of anticipation, like the stillness in the air before a storm breaks. He shifted, not away from me, but to adjust his position. He lifted his head from my chest and propped himself up on one elbow, so he was facing me. His face was only inches from mine, his features softened by the dim light. His eyes, dark pools in the shadows, searched my face. My heart, that traitorous organ, began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I was sure he could hear it. I was sure he could see the panic and the hope warring in my expression. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading and dreaming of for years. He was going to say something. He was going to acknowledge the strangeness of our situation, the intimacy we had been pretending was purely platonic. He was going to put up a wall, and our fragile sanctuary would be shattered. I braced myself for the impact, for the gentle rejection, for the awkward conversation that would follow. But he didn't speak. He just kept looking at me, his gaze so intense, so full of a question he didn't seem to know how to ask. The silence stretched on, thick and electric. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear, but there was something else there too, something I had never seen directed at me before. A tenderness, a raw vulnerability that mirrored my own. He was just as scared as I was. And in that moment, I realized the choice was mine. He had brought us to the edge of the cliff, but he was too afraid to jump. He was waiting for a sign, for permission, for me to meet him halfway. I could pull back. I could make a joke, break the tension, and retreat to the safety of our established friendship. I could preserve the status quo and spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had been brave. Or I could take the biggest risk of my life. I could choose to believe that what I saw in his eyes was real. I could step off the ledge with him. My own fear was a roaring in my ears, screaming at me to protect myself, to retreat to the fortress I had so carefully built. But the hope, the tiny, persistent flame I had been trying to extinguish for years, was stronger. I thought of all the nights I had held him while he slept, of all the silent conversations we'd had, of the profound, unshakable bond that existed between us. It was more than friendship. It had been for a long time. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my free hand and placed it on his cheek. His skin was warm. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into my touch, a barely perceptible movement, and his eyes fluttered closed. A soft, shaky breath escaped his lips. It was all the answer I needed. I closed the small distance between us. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of relief. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, arduous journey. It was the silent, shared acknowledgement of a truth we had both been too afraid to name. In the quiet of the rainy Sunday evening, in the sanctuary of our living room, I had finally stopped observing my life through a lens. I had stepped into the frame, and it was more beautiful and terrifying than any photograph I had ever taken. The morning after was a masterpiece of quiet devastation. I woke up on the couch, alone. A blanket had been tucked around me, a gesture of care that felt like a cruel joke in the harsh morning light. The space beside me was cold. Julian was gone. A quick glance into his room revealed a neatly made bed, and a quick scan of the apartment revealed that his gym bag and keys were missing. He had slipped out before sunrise, without a word, without a note, without even the customary sound of the coffee maker brewing. He had vanished, leaving behind a silence that was louder and more painful than any argument could ever have been. The kiss had felt like a beginning, a revelation. It had been so gentle, so tender, so full of a mutual, unspoken understanding. After that first, hesitant touch, there had been another and another. They were soft, exploratory kisses, filled with years of pent-up affection and the sheer, breathtaking relief of finally letting go. We hadn't spoken. We didn't need to. We had fallen asleep in each other's arms, tangled together on the narrow couch, a perfect, peaceful knot of limbs and shared breaths. It had felt like the most honest moment of my life. I had gone to sleep convinced that everything had changed for the better. I woke up to the chilling realization that perhaps I was the only one who felt that way. My mind, my greatest ally in observation and my worst enemy in matters of the heart, immediately began to spiral. I replayed the entire night, every second of it, searching for a sign I had missed. Had I been too forward? Had I misread his hesitation, mistaking fear for desire? The image of him leaning into my touch, his eyes closing in surrender, had been so clear, so unambiguous. But now, in the sterile light of day, doubt began to poison the memory. Maybe it had been a mistake for him, a moment of weakness, a consequence of loneliness and pain and the strange, artificial intimacy of his recovery. Maybe he had woken up this morning filled with regret, with panic, with disgust. Maybe he was disgusted with me. The pain of that thought was a physical thing, a shard of ice in my chest. The old, familiar fear, the one I had lived with for years, the fear of ruining our friendship, came rushing back with a vengeance. I hadn't just crossed a line, I had obliterated it, and in doing so, I had likely destroyed the most important relationship I had ever had. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a cry for help for a declaration of love. The fortress I had abandoned the night before seemed like a paradise now, a safe, lonely kingdom where I was protected from this kind of heart-wrenching pain. I had risked everything for a single moment of connection, and it seemed I had lost. He didn't come home all day. He didn't answer my texts, two simple, pathetically hopeful messages. "Hey, are you okay?" followed hours later by, "Just let me know you're safe." Each hour that passed without a response was another turn of the screw, tightening the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I couldn't focus on work. I couldn't eat. I paced the small apartment, our shared sanctuary now feeling like a prison cell. The couch, the scene of my supposed triumph, mocked me. I could still feel the phantom weight of him against me, still smell the ghost of his scent on the cushions. The memory, which had been so beautiful just hours before, was now tainted with shame and regret. He finally returned late that night, long after I had given up hope and retreated to my bedroom. I heard the key in the lock, the soft click of the door closing. I lay in my bed, my body rigid, listening. I heard him move through the apartment, his footsteps heavy, weary. He didn't come to my room. He didn't say a word. I heard the soft click of his own bedroom door shutting. That sound, that simple act of closing a door between us, was the final confirmation. He was building a wall. He was retreating back to his side of the universe, leaving me stranded in the wreckage of what I had done. I lay in the dark for what felt like an eternity, the silence from his room a crushing weight. My hurt was slowly curdling into something else, a cold, quiet anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, for running away instead of facing me, and anger at myself for allowing myself to be so vulnerable. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't live in this limbo of unspoken regret, with a closed door between us. The ambiguity of our cuddling ritual had been agonizing, but this was 1,000 times worse. This was a definitive rejection, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. With a resolve that came from having nothing left to lose, I got out of bed, walked down the short, dark hallway, and knocked on his door. The knock was soft, but in the profound silence of the apartment, it sounded like a gunshot. For a long moment, there was no response. I could feel my resolve beginning to crumble, the anger giving way to the familiar ache of despair. I was about to turn away, to retreat back to my room and accept my defeat, when I heard a faint shuffle from inside. The door opened a few inches, not enough for me to see him clearly, just a sliver of his face in the darkness. Leo. His voice was rough, strained. "We need to talk, Julian," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. "You can't just disappear. You can't leave me to wonder. If last night was a mistake, you owe it to me to say it to my face." He was silent for another long beat. I could see his eye in the crack of the door, and it was filled with a misery that mirrored my own. Finally, he let out a defeated sigh and opened the door wider, stepping back to let me in. His room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. He didn't look at me. He just walked over to his bed and sat on the edge, his shoulders slumped, his head in his hands. He looked broken. I closed the door behind me, shutting us into the darkness together. I didn't turn on the light. This felt like a conversation that needed the cover of shadows. I stood there, waiting for him to speak, my heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. "It wasn't a mistake," he finally whispered, his voice so quiet I could barely hear him. His words were muffled by his hands. "That's the problem." I felt a jolt, a flicker of the hope I thought had been extinguished. I took a step closer. "Then what is the problem? Why did you run away?" He lifted his head, and even in the dim light, I could see the sheen of tears in his eyes. He looked utterly lost. "Because I don't know what this is, Leo. I don't know what I'm doing. Kissing you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a long time. And that terrifies me. I'm not," he trailed off, unable to say the words, his hands gesturing helplessly. "I'm the guy on the swim team. I'm the guy who dates girls. I don't know how to be this person, the person who wants to kiss his male best friend." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and painful and breathtakingly honest. All my anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting himself. He was terrified not of what I felt, but of what he felt. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a version of himself he didn't recognize, and he was scared to death. "I spent the whole day just walking," he continued, his voice cracking, "trying to make it make sense, trying to put it back in the box. But I can't. It won't go back. And I look at you, and all I can think about is how I've ruined everything. How I've dragged you into my mess and probably destroyed the one good thing I have left in my life." I crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt on the floor in front of him. I took his hands, pulling them away from his face. They were cold, trembling. I held them tightly in my own. "Julian, look at me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. He slowly lifted his gaze to meet mine. "You haven't ruined anything. Do you have any idea how long I have felt this way about you?" A look of genuine, uncomprehending shock crossed his face. "What? Years," I said, the confession a quiet release of pressure in my own chest. "I have been in love with you for years. I hid it because I was terrified of this exact moment. I was terrified of losing you. So don't you dare think you've dragged me into a mess. I've been living in this mess for a very long time. The only difference is, last night, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was in it alone." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the tears finally spilling over and tracing paths down his cheeks. He was processing it, the years of my silence, the depth of my feelings. He was seeing our entire friendship through a new lens. The cuddling on the couch, my constant presence, my unwavering care, it was all being recontextualized for him in real time. "You love me," he whispered, the words filled with a fragile, dawning wonder. "More than anything," I said, my own eyes blurring. "So you don't have to have it all figured out right now. You don't have to know what it means or who it makes you. All you have to do is not run away. Can you do that? Can you just stay here, with me, and we can be scared and confused together?" He let out a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh, and then he surged forward, wrapping his arms around my neck and burying his face in my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around his waist, holding him tight. He was shaking, but he was here. He wasn't running. We were back in the familiar territory of an embrace, but this time, it was different. There were no pretenses. There was no plausible deniability. It was just 2 people, scared and uncertain, clinging to each other in the dark, finally being honest. The closed door between us was open, and we were on the same side. That conversation was not a magic wand. It didn't instantly solve everything or erase Julian's fear and confusion, but it was a foundation. It was the first solid piece of ground we had to stand on in the new, uncharted territory of our relationship. The days that followed were a delicate dance of advance and retreat. There were moments of breathtaking intimacy, where he would reach for my hand while we were watching TV, or kiss me good morning with a shy, tentative sweetness that made my heart ache. And there were moments where I could feel him pull away, a shadow of anxiety passing over his face as he wrestled with the implications of this new reality. He was recalibrating his entire sense of self, and it was not a smooth or linear process. My role shifted again. I was no longer the secret keeper or the crisis caretaker. I became his patient anchor. I learned to give him space when he needed it, to not push for labels or definitions he wasn't ready for. I learned to read the subtle cues in his body language, to know when a quiet presence was what he needed, and when a gentle touch would be a welcome reassurance. My love for him, which had for so long been a static, hidden thing, a photograph in a locked gallery, had to become something active, something fluid and responsive. It had to be a living, breathing thing that could adapt to his needs, that could be a safe harbor for his turmoil. It was the hardest and most rewarding work of my life. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to build a new normal. The couch ritual continued, but it was transformed. It was no longer a silent, ambiguous arrangement. It was a deliberate act of affection. He would pull me down next to him, tucking my head under his chin, and we would talk for hours in the dark, sharing fears and dreams we had never spoken aloud before. He told me about the pressure from his father to be a certain kind of man, the fear of disappointing his family, the confusion of reconciling his feelings for me with the life he had always envisioned for himself. I told him about the loneliness of my long-held secret, the years of watching him from a distance, the quiet ache of loving someone who you believe you can never have. We were excavating the foundations of our friendship and rebuilding them into something stronger, something that could bear the weight of this new, profound love. The apartment, our little fortress, became a true sanctuary. It was the only place in the world where he could fully be this new version of himself without fear of judgment. Out in the world, he was still navigating the complexities of his identity. He hadn't told his team or his family. That was a battle for another day, and I never pushed him. What mattered was that here, with me, he was completely, beautifully honest. The joy of it was a quiet, steady flame inside me. Seeing him smile, a real, unburdened smile, as I handed him his morning coffee. Feeling him lace his fingers through mine as we walked down the street after dark. A small, rebellious act of togetherness. These were the small moments that built our new world. The healing was a process for both of us. He was healing from the loss of his old identity and the fear of embracing a new one. I was healing from years of self-imposed loneliness and the belief that I was unworthy of being loved in this way. We were two broken pieces learning that we fit together, not perfectly, but in a way that made us both more whole. The physical intimacy, once a source of agonizing tension for me, became a source of profound peace. Waking up in his arms was no longer a dream I was afraid to be shaken from. It was simply the start of my day. The simple domesticity of sharing a life, of folding laundry together, of arguing about what to have for dinner, was imbued with a quiet, sacred magic. This was what I had wanted, what I had never let myself believe was possible. The ordinary, beautiful reality of a life with him. Which brings me back to this morning, back to the hallway, to the scent of sandalwood and bergamot, to the man I love wearing a scent that he knows I love. When he said those words, "I like smelling like what you love," it wasn't an audacious confession anymore. It wasn't the detonation of a bomb. It was a statement of fact, as simple and as true as the sun rising. It was the culmination of our entire journey. He wasn't borrowing my scent to feel closer to something he couldn't have. He was claiming it as his own, integrating a piece of me into a piece of him. It was a declaration that our lives, our identities, were now intertwined. I finally found my voice, there in the narrow hallway that no longer felt like a space we had to negotiate. It felt like a bridge. I reached out and smoothed the collar of his gray sweater, my fingers lingering on the soft fabric, on the warmth of him underneath. A small smile touched my lips. "Me too," I said. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, sure kiss that tasted of coffee and certainty. It was a kiss that held no fear, no hesitation, no questions. It held only the quiet, unshakable truth of our shared present and the beautiful, hopeful promise of our shared future. We had navigated the storm, we had survived the aftermath, and we had found our way to a new shore. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of understanding, full of peace, and full of a love that had finally found its voice. It turned out that the safest place in the world wasn't a fortress at all. It was a home you built with someone else, a door you learned to walk through together, a quiet space where you could simply be and be loved.